I'm Zibby Owens, and you're listening to the award-winning podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Thanks so much for listening to my podcast. If you like what you hear, please follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and also at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Thanks so much for listening. Enjoy it. Today's sponsor is Alley-Oop. We all know how important moms are for our kids, but did you know that one of the biggest influences on a girl's confidence and self-esteem is her dad? So if her dad says she's smart or fearless at sports or she can do anything she puts her mind to, she believes him, maybe more than her mom. I don't know. The praise and confidence a girl gets from her dad stays with her for life. There's a startup out of LA that is focused on just that. Started by a mom, it's called Alley-Oop, and it provides a collection of fun challenges and activities that are specifically designed for a dad and daughter to do together as a team. There are no materials required, and you can access all the challenges virtually through the Alley-Oop app, which you can download from the App Store. Just search for Alley-Oop, Alley-OOP. It's early access only right now, but if you use the code BOOKMOM, capital B for book, capital M for mom, BOOKMOM, all one word, upon sign-in, your favorite dads and daughters can check it out for free. Samantha Harvey is the author of 4 novels, The Wilderness, All Is Song, Dear Thief, and The Western Wind, and she has written a memoir, which we'll talk about today, called The Shapeless Unease. Her novels have been shortlisted for the Orange Prize for Fiction, the Guardian First Book Award, the Walter Scott Prize, and the James Tate Black Prize, and longlisted for the Man Booker Prize, the Bailey's Prize, the Jerwood Fiction Uncovered Prize, and the HWA Gold Crown Award. The Wilderness was the winner of the AMI Literature Award and the Betty Trask Prize, and The Western Wind won the 2019 Staunch Book Prize. She lives in Bath in the UK and is a reader in creative writing at Bath Spa University. Welcome, Sam. Thanks so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books.
Thank you for having me here. I'm very honored.
Oh, and you're in the UK now, is that right?
Yeah, I'm just outside Bath in the southwest of the UK.
Interesting. We're doing this via Skype, and for people not watching, I feel like you have such a perfect British wallpaper behind you. It just looks like, and this like old bookcase, it's perfect. It's exactly how I would imagine where you would be outside of Bath.
Actually, I have a house that's in desperate need of renovation, hence the old-fashioned wallpaper, but it does have a kind of charm about it.
I didn't mean it to suggest it was old-fashioned. It's super charming. It's fantastic. I can't wait to hear about if you're sleeping any better these days, but I loved your book. Can you please tell listeners, from your perspective, give them the little 2-minute wrap-up of what your book is about, if you don't mind. Your most recent book.
Okay, I'll try.
Okay.
So back in 2016, I quite abruptly stopped sleeping. I went from being a really good sleeper to just having very severe insomnia in a matter of weeks, pretty much. And I couldn't write. I'm a novelist, but my career has been as a novelist. And I couldn't write another novel. I didn't really have an idea. And the more sleep deprived I got, the less bandwidth I had to sort of put together the architecture of a novel in my mind on the page. So I just started writing whatever came to me. I felt a really strong need to write because it's the thing that I do that anchors me and makes me feel quite grounded and quite peaceful, really. So I started to write without any idea of what I was writing. I certainly had no idea that I would be writing a book. I just wrote whatever came to me. And I sometimes wrote at night, but that was quite rare. It was more in the day when I was very sleep deprived. And I would write whatever surfaced. I tried not to put too much design on that or influence it too much, just whatever came up. And what came up was all sorts of stuff, fragments of memories and things from my own childhood, thoughts that I was having about the world. There's a kind of essay in there about a tribal people of the Brazilian Amazon. A short story ended up being in there, sort of reflections on being awake and on insomnia itself. All kinds of things, different types of writing in different registers, different tones. And in the end, it amassed to something that was roughly book length. And my agent said, "What have you been writing?" And I said, "Nothing, I can't write a novel. I've just been writing while sleep deprived." And she said, "Well, let me see it." So I gave it to her, and she gave it to my editor, and they decided to publish it as a book. But I was, more surprised than anyone that was the outcome, because that hadn't at all been my intention. And actually, I've never written autobiographically before.
So how do you feel now that this is out in the world? Do you feel sort of self-conscious that it's your innermost sort of stream of consciousness dialogue with yourself, and now there it is? Or do you feel comfortable with it being out there?
I think it's a mix, and it depends on the day. But obviously, once I knew it was going to be published, and when I agreed to it being published, I had to reconcile myself to this knowledge that it would be exposing for me. And I kind of made peace with that. I thought, well, this is what I've written. I'm not ashamed of anything I've written. Obviously, I needed to write it for some reason. If my publisher thinks there's a readership for it and that might be interesting to other people, then so be it. I'm going to go with it. So most of the time, that's how I feel. There are days when I think, what have I done? But on the whole, I feel, I've reconciled myself to it, and I feel like it was a very honest, raw expression of where I was in my life. And I hope that some of that honesty and that rawness reaches people because it's honest and because it sort of connects to something in them.
I loved that part about it. I loved the stream of consciousness. I loved how you experimented, as you said, with all the different forms, how some of it seemed like you were talking to a doctor, having, a diagnosis of yourself in a situation. And then the next would be, it's almost like a script, and then a letter. Like you just were it was so great. And then little snippets of diary entries almost. For someone who reads a lot of books, it was such a nice change because you were constantly keeping the reader engaged and shifting gears and sort of in the chaos of what it feels like to not get a lot of sleep, which everybody has felt at one time or another. So it was almost like the form you used reflected so well the experience you were actually going through. So, which I'm sure was your intention in some way, subconsciously or something, but
subconsciously, yeah, I think it was. And I think I sort of see it now as a kind of simulation of sleep deprivation. So it's not so much about being sleep deprived, but it is sort of a written simulation of what that's like. And that wasn't ever my intention, but I think that was just the kind of inevitable outcome of writing from that place.
I think that's what my outbox looks like. All my emails are an example of sleep deprivation writing at work. Except mine's not going to be a book. It's just how I get through life. One of the things you mentioned in your book that sort of set off, perhaps you thought, this year of not sleeping very well was the death suddenly of your cousin, which I'm so sorry about. And the fact that not only did he die suddenly, but it took some time for him to be discovered as such. Can you talk a little about that? And if you think, looking back, that did have a fair bit to do with what ended up happening to you as a response?
Yeah, I started to get insomnia in the autumn of 2016, and at the same time, sort of it coincided with that my cousin died, and very suddenly he was epileptic, and he died of an epileptic fit. And as you say, he wasn't discovered until a few days later. And I don't know how much of a causal relation there is between the two things, my insomnia and that death. That was one of quite a few things that were going on at the time in my own life that were quite problematic. Not huge things, but things that were troubling. And I don't know if the relationship between the two is causal, if it was more just a correlation that they kind of happened at the same time. So they became very much bound up in one another. So I because I was awake a lot, I began to think a lot about my cousin, and I was very troubled by the fact that he had died, and that he was a contemporary. I wasn't that close to him, but in a way we'd been close as children, but not as adults. There was just something about the loss of someone who was my own age and from my own childhood, and the fact that he died so suddenly. And I just became very troubled by it because I was awake so much. So I was thinking about things too much. And this is, one of the real problems with insomnia, that not only are you awake, you're also, it gives you so many more hours in the day to think about things and to brood over things and to worry. So I think the two things just became very bound up in one another, more than it being a causal thing.
And you also started going back to an incident that happened way back in your past when you were randomly attacked, which and it came pretty far into the book where you started thinking about this again. And perhaps that's where it was like in your consciousness of coming back to it. But tell me about that, because that sounded horrific to me. And you were somewhat, not, I wouldn't say blasé, but you were somewhat matter of fact about it and just sort of presented it as if it was another thing that had happened as opposed to something that was a central thing in your life. Can you just talk a little about the effect it had, and how you handled it then versus how you handle it now?
It's a really interesting thing because I have not had a terrible life by any stretch. It's been, it's had its troubles, but it's been a blessed life as well. So maybe that's, I don't know. When I started writing, inevitably all of this stuff came up that was part of the trouble of life, and that was one of the things that came up, and I was quite interested that it came up really because I was digging around, searching for things that might be the cause of my insomnia. And whenever the relationship I have now to that attack is a really strange one, because I don't feel that I have any trauma from it. At the time it was quite a distressing and brutal thing, and I ended up in hospital for a few days, and I have, metal skeleton in my hand where it was broken, and, so I do have, it's obviously made an impact on my life, but one of the things that has always been strange to me is that it hasn't had as much of an impact as I would have thought. And so I've always wondered, is that because I really did at the time sort of face it and go through what I had to go through with it? Or is it because I've suppressed something? Am I failing to deal with it? And, could that sort of residual trauma be something that is feeding my insomnia now? And so that's why it made its way into the book, because it was one of those things that I was digging out of the suitcase, thinking, could this be it? Could this be the thing that's stopping me sleeping? And it's never felt that it. I've never felt that it was, and I don't know why I feel so little trauma around it. I haven't really worked that out, and I had to identify the man who did it, and he went to prison, and I think maybe because there was that sort of closure on it. Yeah, but even then I felt quite ambivalent about that process, about him going to prison. There was something about it that I really just could never quite get to grips with. So it's left me with this big sort of question mark in my life of how affected am I by this? Am I really as unaffected as I feel I am? It probably sounds like a strange answer, but it's always had this very strange place in my life.
Interesting. I feel like that would be a good book in and of itself. Maybe you should turn that into fiction.
Well, I did. It's actually what started my writing career, funnily enough, because I had been living in Japan for a couple of years, and I was writing. I started writing while I was there, and then I went to Australia when I left Japan. Before I went home, I just went for 3 weeks, and that's where it happened. So when I got home, I couldn't go find work because I had 2 broken hands and head injuries, and so I started writing a novel, and that novel was never published, but I did finish it. And once I'd written that novel, I realized that's what I wanted to do with my life. It was a very clear thing. And that novel was a fictionalized version of that attack and a sort of fictionalized account of all the things that had led up to it. So it's actually had an incredibly impactful place in my life. And maybe that's because I worked it out through fiction that it now doesn't have these sort of traumatic reverberations. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, I think you should dig that one out of the closet and go back to that one in your spare time in the middle of the night, next time.
Yeah.
I just wanted to read a couple of the sentences and the way you wrote about writing, because I loved how you wrote about it. You said, "I look at what I write and it's like being introduced to my soul every time for the first time, not always liking what I see. Writing is dreaming. Not all dreams can be interpreted, and anyway, not all interpretations are right, and anyway, not all interpretations are interesting, and anyway, the dream is the thing unto itself. writing is dreaming. I only discovered that a couple of years ago. It is lucid dreaming, the work of the subconscious that has a toe in the conscious just enough. And then finally you said, writing has saved my life. In the last year, writing has been the next best thing to sleep, sometimes a better thing than sleep. I am sane when I write. My nerves settle. I am sane. I become happy. Nothing else matters when I write, even if what I write turns out to be bad. And that's it. Well, that's most of what I wanted to read, which is beautiful and such a great reflection on how writing can help and how writing interacts with the brain. I mean, it's such a unique thing, really, how writing even works. Can you talk about that just for a minute?
How writing works.
Well, just, it's writing as dreaming, because I hear that quite a bit sometimes. How do you come up with ideas? I don't know. How do I, some writers say it's like a dream. How do you come up with a dream? It just happens. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it feels that it's the same when you can let go and start writing instinctively. And I think that happens when you get past the phase of wanting to understand what the rules are for writing, and what the remit is and what you're allowed to do, what you're not, what works, what doesn't. You have to kind of go through that phase as a writer, I think. It's part of the learning. But when you come through that, and that's not to say you have nothing left to learn, but you've absorbed and internalized enough, you can start getting to something really instinctive. And that's where I think writing becomes more like dreaming than like a sort of a technical craft, because it's always calling on the subconscious and coming from the subconscious. And the less you get in the way of it, the more you find that to be true. And so the things that end up on the page, you may have gone to great lengths to create a fictional world and a character who is adamantly not yourself. But in the end, what you have on the page is your own life, your own preoccupations, your own self, in all sorts of guises and disguises, in the way that you do in a dream. You find if you remember a dream and you look at it and you see it's just all of your desires and fears all dressed up in different costumes. And it's just the same with writing. And I find that really fascinating. And I think that maybe one reason that writing has been such a salvation to me through insomnia is because when you're not sleeping, you're not dreaming. So all the working out that you do through dreams isn't happening. So I think I did that working out through writing. So it was a sort of a surrogate way of dreaming. And I hadn't really realized that at the time. It only occurred to me a few months ago. And I thought, yeah, I can see why that was such a necessary thing for me to do, because I didn't have any other way of processing my subconscious. So it was an incredibly powerful realization. And it's, this book, if nothing else, has absolutely restored my faith in writing, which was flagging a little bit. There must have been thoughts of, what's the point of writing novels, and the world is going to hell, what's the point? And I now think that sort of answered that question for me.
Good. How are you sleeping now?
Better than I was when I wrote the book, but I'm still definitely an insomniac, and I don't know how to resolve that. I think the thing that whatever the triggers were that instigated it have gone to an extent, but it's now being fueled by its own internal processes, as insomnia is. The triggers might go away, but you're left with this kind of really intractable habit of body and mind, and I'm struggling to break that. So it's still an ongoing struggle, but it's not anything like as severe as it was.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad at least it's getting better. Although I don't know. I mean, another book like this would be great too. Are you working on another book now, or?
I am just beginning to research a new novel. It's been 3 years nearly since I finished my last novel, and that's I've never had a gap of anything like that length between novels before. So it's been a really big absence in my life. So I wrote The Shapeless Unease in between. But in terms of a novel and that kind of world building of a novel and the research and the entirely absorbing, lengthy process of it, that's been absent. And that's a really strange thing for me. So I am now beginning to research. I haven't started writing it, but I'm researching something new, and I feel kind of excited by it at the moment. So that's good.
That's good.
I feel like I do have most days the capacity to write it. So yeah, but it's been a very long process to get here. Very strange, very strange one of, I've always had an idea for a novel queued up before I finished the last. So to have had no idea for 3 years has been really unnerving.
That's nice to know they came back.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just a necessary part of the process.
I feel like you've given so much advice through your vantage point on writing, but if you had to give one piece of advice to somebody who is trying to struggle through writing or attack a new book or anything, what advice would you give?
This is such a difficult question.
You don't have to answer it.
I'll do my best.
Okay.
I think that writing, this is going to sound like an incredibly nebulous, abstract answer, but I think that writing is a sort of expression of love in a way. It's a very expansive thing to do. It asks a lot of you. It asks you to open your heart. And I think if you're going to write a novel or anything, write it from that kind of expanded, generous place in yourself. And you can sort of feel for that. And write for no other reason, because, I think this for myself, and it's why my faith was flagging a bit, the world doesn't need another novel. There are so many novels in the world. But that's not to say that if you write something that's absolutely from the heart and feels like it needs to be written, there will be a place for it in the world. So I think that's the only reason to write, and it's the only place to write from. In any case, that's how it is for me.
That's great advice. See, you did great. I'm glad I asked.
It doesn't feel that practical somehow. But
it still helps. It all helps. It all helps. Well, thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. And thank you for sharing your experience, not just with me today, but also through your book. I'm glad it didn't just stay, in a journal on your desk or whatever, and that it became something that the world could share, because I found it very helpful and interesting and thought-provoking and different and a joy to read. So thank you.
Thank you, Zippy.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks again for listening to my podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you liked this episode, please follow me on Instagram @ZibbyOwens and @Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books, and sign up for my mailing list at zibbyowens.com so you can always hear about the latest things I'm up to. Thanks a lot. Thanks to today's sponsor, Alley-Oop, ALLEY-OOP. Check it out at the App Store and start bonding with dads and daughters right away for free with code BOOKMOM, BOOK capital B, MOM capital M, if that makes sense. BOOKMOM. Thanks for checking it out. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music. Thanks for listening. You could always email me at zibby@zibbyowens.com.